The final whistle echoed through a packed stadium as thousands of fans celebrated another unforgettable World Cup night. Players dropped to the grass in exhaustion. Coaches embraced their staff. Cameras captured the emotion that only football's biggest stage can create. But away from the celebrations, another story was beginning to dominate the headlines. Flights between host cities were getting longer. Recovery time was getting shorter. Fans were struggling with expensive travel, while players and managers quietly questioned whether the tournament had simply become too demanding. The expanded 48-team World Cup had promised more nations, more matches, and more unforgettable moments. Instead, it was forcing everyone to ask the same uncomfortable question. Had FIFA made the tournament too big to manage? This wasn't about one controversial decision or one bad match. It was about dozens of small problems appearing at the same time. Problems many people had predicted years earlier, but few expected to become so visible once the World Cup finally arrived. As the tournament unfolded, every incredible goal, every dramatic upset, and every emotional celebration was matched by another debate happening just outside the spotlight. So how did football's most ambitious World Cup become FIFA's biggest nightmare? Let's go back to the decision that changed everything. And if you enjoy football documentaries that uncover the story behind the biggest moments in the game, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. It began with applause. In December 2022, FIFA officially confirmed that the 2026 World Cup would be unlike anything football had ever seen. For the first time, 48 nations would compete instead of 32. 3 countries, the United States, Canada, and Mexico, would share hosting duties across 16 cities. The tournament would grow from 64 matches to an unprecedented 104. For FIFA, it was presented as football's biggest step forward. More countries would experience the World Cup. More fans would see their national team on the biggest stage. More cities would become part of football history. The announcement was greeted with excitement. National associations celebrated new qualification opportunities. Smaller football nations suddenly believed the impossible was now within reach. For millions of supporters around the world, the dream of seeing their country play in a World Cup had never felt closer. But almost immediately, another conversation began. Unlike previous tournaments, this World Cup wouldn't be concentrated inside a single country. Teams could find themselves traveling thousands of kilometers between matches, crossing multiple time zones while trying to recover, train, and prepare for the next opponent. Coaches quietly questioned whether recovery would become just as important as tactics. Sports scientists warned that longer travel and shorter preparation could affect player performance. Even supporters started calculating the cost of following their teams from one city to another, realizing that attending multiple matches might require several flights instead of a few hours on a bus or train. None of these concerns overshadowed the excitement. Not yet. Because on paper, the expanded World Cup still looked like football's greatest celebration. It wasn't until the tournament finally began that everyone discovered what those extra teams, extra matches, and extra miles would really mean. The first matches delivered exactly what FIFA had hoped for. Packed stadiums, deafening crowds, new nations making history. Every day brought another dramatic finish, another upset, another unforgettable celebration. From the stands, the expanded World Cup looked like a complete success. Behind the scenes, however, the pace of the tournament was becoming impossible to ignore. Instead of settling into one region, several teams found themselves constantly moving between host cities spread across the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Recovery sessions were squeezed between airport transfers, hotel check-ins, tactical meetings, and media obligations. Every hour spent traveling was an hour that couldn't be spent preparing. Managers began adjusting training sessions simply because there wasn't enough time. Players spoke about spending more time on planes than on the training ground. Medical staff worked around the clock to manage fatigue, while support teams raced to move equipment across thousands of kilometers before the next kickoff. The challenge wasn't limited to the players. Supporters hoping to follow their teams faced expensive flights, long airport queues, and back-to-back travel across an entire continent. For many, watching every match in person became almost impossible. Social media filled with videos of fans rushing through terminals, delayed flights, and marathon road trips just to make kickoff. The football was still delivering unforgettable moments. But with every passing round, another question kept growing louder. If simply getting from one match to the next had become this difficult, what would happen when the pressure of the knockout stage pushed every team, and every host city, to their limits? As the group stage came to an end, attention shifted from the pitch to the stands. Some venues delivered exactly what FIFA had dreamed of. Hours before kickoff, fans filled the streets wearing every color imaginable. Chants echoed through downtown districts, stadiums shook after every goal, and television cameras captured an atmosphere worthy of football's biggest tournament. But not every match looked the same. For several lower-profile fixtures, cameras caught noticeable patches of empty seats. Tickets that had been expected to sell quickly were still available close to kickoff. On social media, photos comparing packed stadiums with quieter sections spread rapidly, raising questions about whether 104 matches had stretched fan demand too far. Outside the stadiums, the challenge was becoming even more visible. Supporters battled heavy traffic, crowded public transport, and long journeys between host cities. Some fans traveled hundreds, even thousands, of kilometers in just a few days, trying to keep up with their national teams. What had looked manageable on paper was becoming exhausting in reality. The media quickly picked up the story. Instead of focusing only on goals and celebrations, headlines began asking whether the tournament's massive scale had created problems no previous World Cup had ever faced. Commentators praised the football but questioned whether the logistics had become just as important as the matches themselves. The spectacle inside the stadiums was still unforgettable. But beyond the final whistle, the conversation was beginning to change. And once the knockout stage arrived, every mistake, every delay, and every sign of fatigue would be impossible to hide. By the time the knockout stage began, there was no room for mistakes. Every match carried the weight of elimination. Every sprint, every tackle, and every substitution could decide whether a nation's dream continued or ended in 90 minutes. The football was spectacular. Underdogs refused to back down. Heavy favorites were pushed to their limits. Extra time and penalty shootouts tested players who had already spent weeks traveling across North America. As the pressure increased, so did the physical demands. After several high-intensity matches, cameras captured exhausted players collapsing onto the grass before the celebrations had even begun. Coaches used nearly every available substitution, while medical teams rushed onto the field more frequently than earlier in the tournament. Post-match interviews were filled with one recurring theme: recovery. Managers spoke about having barely enough time to prepare for the next opponent. Training sessions became lighter. Tactical work was shortened. The priority was no longer improving performance. It was simply getting players ready for kickoff. Meanwhile, debate intensified off the pitch. Pundits questioned whether the expanded format had added excitement or simply added strain. Former players argued over fixture congestion, while supporters defended the tournament's unforgettable drama despite the growing logistical challenges. For FIFA, the World Cup was still breaking attendance records and producing unforgettable moments. But the discussion had changed. People were no longer asking whether the expanded tournament could work. They were asking whether football had quietly reached its limit. And when the tournament finally came to an end, the numbers, and the reactions, would reveal why many called it FIFA's biggest World Cup nightmare. When the trophy was finally lifted, the images that defined the tournament weren't limited to the celebrations. There were unforgettable goals, historic upsets, new nations announcing themselves on football's biggest stage. Millions of fans packed stadiums across the United States, Canada, and Mexico, making the 2026 World Cup one of the most watched tournaments in history. But once the celebrations faded, a different set of numbers began to dominate the conversation. The tournament had featured 48 teams, 104 matches, and travel distances unlike anything football had experienced before. Players, coaches, supporters, and journalists had all witnessed the same challenge from different perspectives. For some, the expanded format made the World Cup bigger than ever. For others, it pushed the competition to its practical limits. The debate no longer centered on whether the football had been entertaining. It clearly had. Instead, people questioned whether the tournament's scale had become too difficult to manage. Could a competition spread across an entire continent still deliver the same experience for players and supporters? Or had the ambition to make the World Cup bigger also made it more complicated? For FIFA, the 2026 World Cup proved that expansion could create unforgettable moments. It also proved that every extra team, every extra match, and every extra kilometer came with a price. Whether history remembers this tournament as football's greatest evolution or the moment the World Cup became too big will depend on what happens next. So what do you think? Did the expanded 48-team World Cup make football better, or did it create problems that were impossible to ignore? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe for more football documentaries that explore the stories behind the biggest moments in the game.